Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your daily deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Chris, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Chris. And I have to say, today's story feels like one of those moments we will look back on years from now as a genuine turning point in how the world organizes itself around artificial intelligence.
The hat is a big claim to open with, so set the scene for us. What actually happened in Shanghai this week that has everyone in the policy world talking?
So, on July 16th of 2026, on the eve of the annual World Artificial Intelligence Conference in Shanghai, 29 countries signed an agreement creating something called the World Artificial Intelligence Cooperation Organization, or WAICO for short.
And then the next day, Xi Jinping himself stepped up to unveil it in a major speech, which tells you immediately how much political weight Beijing is putting behind this particular initiative.
Exactly right, and the symbolism was carefully staged. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres actually attended the signing ceremony, which gives the whole thing a veneer of global legitimacy that Beijing very much wanted cameras to capture.
Let's talk membership, because I think the roster of founding countries tells you almost everything about what this organization really is and who it is actually designed to appeal to.
The founding members include Indonesia, Brazil, Malaysia, South Africa, Senegal, Russia, and Pakistan, plus Belarus, Serbia, Cuba, and Venezuela. And in total, you get 10 African states and 12 Asian states in the mix.
So what jumps out at me right away is who is not on that list? No United States, no United Kingdom, no European Union members, no Japan, no South Korea. This is very deliberately not a Western club.
That absence is the entire point, Chris. This is a coalition anchored in the global South, the countries that have historically had almost no seat at the table when technology standards and governance rules get written by richer nations.
And Xi leaned into that framing pretty hard in his speech, didn't he? Walk us through the actual language he used, because the rhetoric here is doing a lot of strategic work.
He urged countries to cooperate on artificial intelligence and insisted that no single country should dominate the technology, which everyone in the room understood as a barely disguised jab at the United States and its export control regime.
Right, and he went further than just rhetoric. There were concrete commitments in that speech, actual resources on the table, which is what separates this from the usual diplomatic communique that gets forgotten within a week.
Absolutely, and the numbers matter here. China pledged 5,000 spots in AI training and seminar programs for developing countries over the next 5 years, which is a real capacity-building investment aimed directly at future technical elites.
5,000 people trained in Chinese institutions on Chinese tooling, probably on Chinese open source models. That is soft power infrastructure being laid one engineer at a time, and it compounds over a decade.
And beyond the training, Xi pledged to build AI application cooperation centers alongside ASEAN, the Arab League, the African Union, BRICS, and other major regional blocs, which essentially embeds Chinese AI institutions inside every major regional grouping outside the West.
Okay, so let me push on the skeptical angle for a moment, because I can already hear listeners asking whether this is a real institution or just an elaborate press release with a headquarters attached.
That is a fair challenge, and honestly, the answer is we do not fully know yet. But the organization has a permanent headquarters in Shanghai, a founding treaty signed by 29 governments, and the personal sponsorship of Xi himself.
And history suggests we should not dismiss these things too quickly. People laughed at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank when Beijing launched it, and that institution now has over 100 members, including many American allies.
That is exactly the precedent I keep coming back to. Beijing has a proven playbook for building parallel institutions when it feels locked out of existing ones, and WAICO looks like that playbook applied to artificial intelligence governance.
So let's zoom out and talk about what this means structurally. Because the way I read it, the world now effectively has two competing institutional frameworks for governing artificial intelligence, and they are not talking to each other much.
Right. On one side, you have the framework anchored in Brussels, Washington, and the G7, built around the EU AI Act, export controls and safety summits. On the other side, you now have one being assembled in Shanghai.
And those two frameworks embody genuinely different philosophies about what AI governance is even for, which I think is the deepest part of this story and worth spending some real time on.
Completely agree. Washington's approach has centered on security, on keeping frontier capabilities out of rival hands through chip export controls and investment restrictions. Beijing is countering with a message about access, affordability, and open source models as a public good.
That public good framing is fascinating to me because Xi explicitly warned that unequal access to AI risks creating what he called new historical injustices, which is language engineered to resonate with post-colonial nations.
It is incredibly shrewd rhetoric, Chris. If you're a developing country that cannot afford frontier lab pricing and cannot buy restricted chips anyway, then free open weight models from China are not propaganda. They are simply the only offer on the table.
And that is the uncomfortable truth for Western policymakers, right? The export control strategy that was designed to slow China down has also, as a side effect, pushed a lot of the global South toward Chinese alternatives.
There is a real strategic irony there. By focusing so heavily on denial, on who cannot have what, Washington left the affirmative pitch, the who gets helped question, almost entirely open for Beijing to claim at a moment like this.
Now, she called WAICO a milestone in the history of world AI development, which is obviously self-serving, but let's steelman it. Is there a version of this where the organization genuinely does useful work?
There genuinely could be. Most countries on Earth have no AI regulatory capacity at all. No technical standards bodies, no safety institutes. If WAICO delivers training, shared infrastructure, and model access to those countries, that fills a vacuum nobody else was filling.
But the flip side is that whoever fills that vacuum also gets to define the defaults, the technical standards, the values baked into the systems, and even the surveillance norms that come bundled with the technology stack.
And that is the real long game. Standards are sticky. If a generation of ministries and telecoms across Africa and Southeast Asia build on Chinese AI stacks and Chinese governance templates, unwinding that later becomes practically impossible for the West.
I want to bring in the timing angle too, because this launch did not happen in a vacuum. The World Artificial Intelligence Conference itself opened with something like 300 product debuts, which is a statement all by itself.
Yes, roughly 300 products debuting at the conference. And that scale matters because it lets Beijing pair the diplomatic announcement with a very visible demonstration that its domestic AI ecosystem is vibrant, commercial, and shipping constantly despite the chip restrictions.
So the message to visiting delegations from the Global South is essentially, look around, sanctions have not stopped us, and if you align with our framework, you get access to all this energy and tooling.
Precisely. And remember that Chinese open weight models have been genuinely competitive lately. So this is not an empty showroom. For many of these countries, the practical experience is that the Chinese stack works well and costs dramatically less.
Let me ask the question our American listeners are probably sitting with right now. How worried should Washington actually be about 29 mostly developing countries forming a club with Beijing at the center of it?
I would say moderately worried, but for the right reasons. WAICO will not out-research Silicon Valley or out-capitalize American hyperscalers anytime soon. The risk is different. It is about votes, norms, and legitimacy in international bodies over the next decade.
Explain that a bit more. Because I think the connection between an AI cooperation organization and things like United Nations votes is not immediately obvious to people outside the diplomacy world.
Sure, so when global AI rules eventually get negotiated in venues like the United Nations, every country gets a vote regardless of size. A bloc of aligned nations that shares Beijing's positions on sovereignty and non-interference becomes a durable voting coalition.
So even if WAICO never produces a single breakthrough model, it could still shift the center of gravity on questions like surveillance norms, data governance, and whether AI safety rules should constrain state power at all.
Exactly. And notice that the framing of safety differs too. The Western conversation increasingly centers on frontier model risk and catastrophic misuse, while the WAICO framing centers on development rights, access equity, and preventing technological hegemony by any one power.
There's also a domestic politics layer here for the member countries themselves, because signing up for a Chinese-led organization is not cost-free, when many of them also want American investment and trade relationships.
That tension is very real. Brazil and Indonesia, for example, are classic hedging states that want good relations with both superpowers. So their participation signals they see WAICO as additive leverage rather than a hard alignment choice against Washington.
Which suggests the smart Western response is not outrage, but competition, actually offering these countries a better deal on training, compute access, and model availability than they are getting from Beijing right now.
And some analysts made exactly that point this week, that the correct answer to WAICO is an affirmative Western program for AI development in the Global South. Something with real resources rather than another declaration of shared democratic values.
Do you see any scenario where these two governance frameworks eventually converge? Or are we locked into a bipolar AI world for the foreseeable future with every country forced to pick a stack and a rulebook?
My honest read is partial convergence on boring technical standards, things like model evaluation methods and incident reporting, because everyone benefits there. But persistent divergence on the political questions of surveillance, speech, and state control, where the values genuinely conflict.
That feels right to me. A world where the plumbing interoperates, but the politics do not, which frankly resembles how the internet itself fractured into distinct governance zones over the past 15 years.
And that internet precedent should be a warning, Chris, because the splinternet emerged gradually through exactly these kinds of institutional choices, each one small, until one day the fragmentation was simply an irreversible fact of life for everyone.
Before we wrap up, I want to touch on Russia's presence in this founding group, because having Moscow alongside Cuba, Belarus, and Venezuela gives Western critics an easy talking point about what this club really represents.
It absolutely does, and Beijing knew that cost going in. Including sanctioned states signals that WAICO will not enforce Western-style political conditions on membership, which is reassuring to some governments and alarming to others, depending entirely on where you sit.
It also raises practical questions about what gets shared inside this organization, because cooperation centers and training programs could become channels for capabilities that Washington has spent years trying to keep away from exactly these governments.
That is the dual-use worry in a nutshell, and it is legitimate. Though I would note that most of what WAICO promises so far is applications-level cooperation, agriculture, healthcare, education tooling, rather than frontier model development or advanced chip access.
Fair enough, and honestly, the applications layer is where most of the world actually lives. The average ministry in Dakar or Jakarta cares far more about a working crop forecasting system than about any frontier benchmark score.
Which is exactly why this pitch lands, Chris. The West talks about existential risk and compute thresholds while Beijing shows up with deployable tools, financing, and training seats, and for many governments, that contrast decides the question before it is even debated.
So as we wrap up, give listeners the bottom line. What should they actually watch for over the next 6 to 12 months to judge whether WAICO becomes consequential or fades into diplomatic wallpaper?
Watch 3 things: whether membership grows beyond 29, especially any wealthy or technically serious countries joining; whether the training programs and cooperation centers actually launch with real budgets; and whether WAICO positions start showing up in United Nations negotiations as a coordinated bloc.
And I would add one more. Watch how Washington and Brussels respond. Because if the answer is purely more restrictions rather than a compelling affirmative offer, the WAICO pitch to the Global South only gets stronger from here.
Beautifully said, and it captures why this story matters beyond the headlines. The race for artificial intelligence is not only about who builds the smartest model, it is increasingly about who writes the rules everyone else lives under.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.